Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Dennis, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. It is a joy to welcome you to tonight's resident talk. Sitka is located at Cascade Head on the north central Oregon coast and resides on the unceded traditional lands of the indigenous people now represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. There is much to learn as just one step that we can take, especially if you're planning a trip to visit Sitka or the coast. Visit the Grand Ronde Chichalu Museum and Cultural Center. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the first of tonight's residents. Connor Gordon comes to Sitka as one of two Blue Sky residents, a collaboration between the Blue Sky Gallery in Portland and the Sitka Center Photography Residency. Connor Gordon is an Oregon-based artist exploring photography as unreliable narration. His work has been exhibited at spaces including Solace Gallery in Seattle, Washington, Ditch Projects in Springfield, Oregon, Blue Sky Gallery in Portland, Oregon, The Humid in Athens, Georgia, and Filter Space in Chicago, Illinois. He was a 2019-2020 Fulbright research grantee to Serbia, where he photographed the legacy of Yugoslav-era architecture. He received a BA in political science from DePauw University and holds an MFA in art from the University of Oregon. He has self-published 3 zines and will release his first photo book in 2025. So let us be joyful together, Sitka community, and make some noise wherever we are in support of the arts, science, and all of tonight's speakers, beginning with Connor Gordon. Welcome to Sitka, Connor.
Thanks so much, Allison. And thanks so much to the entire Sitka team. I just kind of got back from Sitka and still processing coming down from that experience, but it was a really kind of transformative, generative January. So just to give you a very quick introduction to my overall artistic practice, I'm really interested, as Allison mentioned, in this idea of photography as unreliable narration. So photography, often a medium that's associated with the essential or being able to act as evidence or like this objective view of something that really happened out in the world. I think the true story of photography is a lot more complicated than that. And in many ways, photography as a medium doesn't quite live up to that potential as being this truth-telling, communicative, objective, decisive medium, decisive moment. And what I'm really interested in my kind of artistic practice is centering that concept. So looking at the ways in which a fallible or an imperfect photograph, or a photograph that might mistranslate or fail to fully represent reality, is actually like a possibility for new creative potential rather than something that we need to paper over or just kind of pretend that that's not in the room. I moved to Oregon in 2021, and ever since, really a main way that has taken shape is by thinking about the legacy of landscape photography in this particular space and photography in kind of mediating our relationship with landscape and place and what happens when that mediation might get complicated or fall apart. So in this kind of past work, which is sort of kind of a bridge to what I was doing at Sitka, it's titled The Overlook. And I was thinking about how the Oregon coast is very much kind of framed in our minds, both literally and conceptually, by this idea of the definitive view, where if you've driven up the Pacific Coast Highway, every couple miles, there's always a scenic overlook or a state park where you can just pull your car over, walk right out, and see this kind of definitive sublime spectacle. And a lot of the times it's very explicitly framed, whether that be, a plaque telling you an area of interest, or literally sometimes a spot on the ground that's painted to the ground, kind of showing like where you can stand and take in this kind of awe-inspiring sight. I think it's something that's kind of very strange because it positions the sublime or our experience with a particular place in this way that's supposed to be accessible, reproducible, like legible. Again, something that you can have the exact same experience as the car of tourists that just showed up right before you and the car that's showing up right after. And ultimately photo ready, something you can photograph, get that same photograph as everybody else and take home and relive that experience. Just having spent a lot of time in these spaces, that always felt very at odds with my own experience of the sublime, or my own experience of these spaces, which always felt very idiosyncratic, overwhelming, and most importantly, impossible to like neatly pin down or sum up, no less than in a photograph. So I was thinking a lot about the role of photography that we kind of, or maybe the role we place on photography in communicating the sublime and how it fails to live up to that. As I was trying to kind of untangle these contradictions, again, as a photographer, very invested in these ideas of what can I do with the image and what is it communicating? What do we expect it to do? I'd been casually taking a lot of pictures through a pair of binoculars that my wife had given me. So I was just kind of holding my phone up to the back of the binoculars, seeing what I could kind of capture as this casual sort of vernacular process. I've heard it described as like dad gear. Like you roll out of the RV with this elaborate setup to try and get the perfect image. And I think what I found really interesting about this process is it was sort of predicated on similar ideas of legibility, that you could, slap your phone into this binocular rig and just perfectly capture this image, perfectly capture what you were looking at, and it would bring like a sublime experience into clear view. At least that's what it says on the box when you pick it up. But I found that the resulting images I was making, so for instance, this and the following images created with this setup, were anything but that, anything but simple and anything but clear. So a lot of the times the binoculars would cause vignetting or lens flare happening in the images, and then the phone's noise reduction algorithms or autofocus would really struggle, kind of veil the images in pixelation or blur. In terms of objective documents, they were really, really, really bad. And they really didn't at all capture, what I was actually looking at. But I was really interested in that imperfection and in the ways that seemingly as I was looking at the images, the less representative they got, the more interested I got in them. So I was interested in that tension between these images are not working to communicate the original experience, but they're becoming more resonant to me as they become more abstract and start kind of falling apart. And so ultimately, I started kind of chasing some of those flaws, I guess, as formal elements and really centering them in this work to kind of try and pull away from this idea of legibility and reproducibility of a sublime experience and how we kind of expect the photograph to do that when we're looking at a landscape. So unlike a conventional landscape photograph, many of these images feature very little to no representation of the landscape, certainly not in a way that's, legible from foreground to background, etc. And in that way, I'm trying to kind of decouple the sublime from being this like fixed point on a map or fixed element in the terrain, and instead kind of position it as this process that, or this feeling that arises by looking at something and bringing that element of subjectivity into it, something that, can only exist by looking at something or can only exist by looking at something with a camera rather than something that's just out there and the camera is happening to perfectly kind of document. And so just a couple more images from this series. Throughout this work, and I think in the work I was doing at Sitka as well, I'm really trying to play with this idea between specificity and ambiguity in photography. Photographs are really great at being very specific in some ways, but also completely ambiguous in other ways. So for instance, in these works, the titles are kind of suggesting this specificity of the photograph, of containing this experience. If you stand exactly at these GPS coordinates where the image was taken, you'll be able to get the same thing that, is happening in the images, which again is sort of impossible. It's certainly extremely difficult to achieve because without a particular, without looking at the landscape through this particular setup or in this particular way, there's no reference to the topography here. And you're certainly not getting any legibility or understanding of the space through the images. So trying to play with this idea of ambiguity in the images, also kind of refusal of non-representation and abstraction as a way to kind of reframe landscape photography and what we expect from it. And so in this way, I'm also, trying to destabilize how a traditional landscape photograph looks and functions, reorienting these images from being photographs about landscape to photographs about looking, and trying to, recontextualize the sublime as something that is subjective and ultimately beyond representation. If the sublime is truly sublime, can it really be contained in, a rectangle on our phones or on a wall? I think that's some of the questions and certainly things I was thinking about at Sitka as well. So these are a couple other images I wanted to talk about. I went into Sitka and still am confused about this, not quite settled on it, because in addition to these very conceptually loaded images from the overlook, I was also taking these more straightforward images at the time, images that mean a great deal to me, but are, again, much more traditional and straightforward in their approach, representational versus abstract, and maybe more specific in that regard. And so again, they're very important images to me, but it's something I've never quite figured out how to incorporate, especially now that I feel like in some ways I've kind of walled myself into this little lane of a conceptual abstraction and non-representation. What bearing do these images have on my practice now? So that was something I really went into Sitka thinking is like, okay, what am I going to do with these? Is it something that just stays on my hard drive or, hangs on my own wall but never goes out into public? Or is there something else going on here? So this is kind of a mix of past images, but also a few I made during my time at Sitka. And as I was making these images, a phrase that kind of kept coming to mind was this idea of a prism without an edge. And so something that's radiant and beautiful and strange that I find myself drawn to its beauty. Ultimately, unlike a prism, a prism with an edge, there's no kind of clarifying kind of vertex or point that helps me understand it. So again, I kind of return to these spaces again and again. I've spent years going to the coast at least once every couple weeks and just spent a month out there kind of looking for maybe leaning on photography, but trying to figure out my own relationship to these spaces. Again, with their very complicated histories and also kind of their contemporary kind of structures. And what I think is really interesting about this is it feels like it's sort of this unending question. I'm taking these photographs to try and figure out why this space is so important to me and what my role is to it, what my relationship is to it, but it never clarifies. It never gets broken down to its constituent elements. And so that's sort of a phrase I keep kind of returning to in this work and thinking about whether I can communicate that through the photographs, thinking about these maybe as reflections of process and as this sort of continual return and desire to spend time in these spaces in a way that never fully materializes or coalesces into a neat moral or point, I guess. So it's very much work that's ongoing. Took a lot of pictures kind of for this loose body of work at Sitka. Yeah, still thinking about that, but TBD there. Another project I wanted to talk about that I kind of just started at Sitka and I'm really excited about are these images. So really interested, again, as I mentioned, in non-representation, photographic abstraction, and how to kind of represent a landscape in a way that might separate it or divorce it a little bit from a straightforward representation. As I was walking around it in Lincoln City, I kept finding these rocks on the beach that had these really incredible like lattices of holes kind of eroded through them. I did some research and figured out this is actually, it's called bivalve erosion. So when a mussel or a barnacle attaches itself to a rock, it digs like a little hole or like a little indentation. And then over time, the erosion of the waves and the water rushing into these kind of indentations causes these really beautiful like holes to appear through these rocks. And I was really interested in these. They're just gorgeous objects in their own right. And I was really interested in if I was to typically. So I began collecting these rocks and using them to make a lumen print. Essentially, a lumen print is where you take an undeveloped piece of photo paper, like black and white photo paper, and you just put an object on top of it to make a photogram. So over the course of several hours, as you kind of leave these out in the sun, they record not only the silhouette of the object, but the quality and quantity of light that's falling on that piece of paper. So you'll get kind of different colors, you'll get reflections off of the rocks, you'll get shadows and in spaces where the paper is unexposed to light, and also little kind of tunnels of light coming through where those holes are. So I kind of began these as object studies. Again, I thought they were just gorgeous little interesting kind of trinkets that you might pick up and put in your pocket on the beach. But after looking at them, they almost kind of started to feel like these sort of alternative or imagined landscapes in their own right, especially as I began kind of scanning these, working with them digitally, making them larger than their source material, etc. Really felt like these, yeah, transformations of landscape, but also reflective of, I think, a lot of the same reasons that I'm interested in photographing the coast, like this ever shifting quality of light that you can go to one place at 5 p.m. and it'll be a completely different than 6 p.m. And you can have this kind of ever unfolding, non-reproducible, non-repeatable experience that you kind of keep chasing by revisiting these spaces over and over again. And kind of much like some of the work I was thinking about in the Overlook, failures of representation or reproducibility, I'm also interested in the fragility or precarity of these. So the rocks themselves, pretty much the second you take them out of water or the second they dry, they start to fall apart. They're incredibly fragile, so they don't stick around long. And the prints themselves are also unfixed, so they haven't been chemically treated to make them no longer light sensitive. So you can store them forever in a black bag, but if you leave them out, they fade away. And so I think that impermanence is really interesting to me. Poses a lot of technical challenges in terms of like, okay, how would I even show these to other people? But I think that sense of impermanence, that sense of fleetingness, I think, again, is at the core of how I'm thinking about the sublime and my own relationship to these spaces. And so I'm really interested in how kind of the material process here can echo that idea of impermanence and sort of the non-transferability of an experience with the sublime. So this is very much ongoing work. I'm still playing around with these objects and different kind of effects and different kind of qualities of light I can achieve in them, moving things around, doing multiple exposures, etc. But really excited about this as a potential new direction and something I can keep playing around with, even after I finished up at Sitka. And then finally, one more kind of little project I worked on there, sort of as what began as an echo of like Robert Smithson's like mirror displacements. I was really inspired by the formal elements of that work. And I was like, okay, what if the rectangle in those images was a photograph or a print, a piece of paper instead of a mirror? But ultimately changed was essentially taking these light sensitive pieces of paper and placing them out in like an outdoor space or a natural space and rephotographing them. And I think ultimately, I think this kind of changed, and I'm still interested in seeing how this develops. But I was really interested in how these are in some ways a very direct record of the space they were made. So again, the exact quantity of light, the exact quality of light is going to influence the color of the paper and how it turned out, and then any shadows that were kind of projected onto the paper by nearby objects. But also, they're almost entirely blank a lot of the time because other than registering the quality of light, there's not really a lot of definition or detail you can really build into those just by virtue of making them in this kind of unstructured, unprocessed way. So again, returning to some of those ideas of specificity and ambiguity and how those things can kind of live side by side to create a photographic record, quote unquote, maybe not, of landscape and relation to place. So yeah, that's kind of where things stand right now. Really excited about these kind of new directions and yeah, deeply grateful for Sitka, the opportunity, and the folks who kind of make it possible to do amazing things like this. So yeah, thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Connor. There's a couple of comments just that the images are phenomenal from Adam, and Joan asks, really love the idea of impertinence and couldn't help but think of how art lives on after the artist ought it.
Yeah, really interesting question. Like, because yeah, there's kind of the death of the author idea too. Like, I think that art certainly good art and great art like certainly does live past the experience of the artist and takes on this whole new life that you can't possibly imagine or predict. So in that way, I think it's really interesting. But yeah, also like author does have to die, artist does have to die at that. So yeah, how you navigate that as an artist is definitely an interesting question. So yeah.
Thank you again, Connor, for taking us inside your practice. Felipe Shibuya is a Brazilian ecologist and artist who decided to adventure around the world. His journey began when he completed his PhD in ecology and nature conservation at the Federal University of Paraná. He then decided to explore the visual aspects he had included in his research beyond the purely scientific perspective. Felipe also holds an MFA in studio art from the State University of New York at Buffalo, where he worked with pigmented bacteria with the intention of understanding how colors they synthesize could be communication signals for humans. Being a scientist artist enables Felipe to explore different forms of life, from bacteria to trees, using different methods, from microbiological culture to videos. However, all of his work involves aspects of his own identity, and he always highlights the visuality of nature. Currently, he's an assistant professor in the Experimental and Foundation Studies Division at Rhode Island School of Design. Please join me in warmly welcoming Felipe Shibuya to Sitka.
Thank you so much, Alison. Hi all. Yes, thank you so much for having me here today. And you know, it's such a pleasure to be here at Sitka, but also immersed in this beautiful landscape. It's my first time in this coast, so I'm really enjoying the landscape. And yes, my name is Felipe. As Alison said, I'm an ecologist and a visual artist from Brazil, but I'm based in Boston. And today I'm going to speak very quickly about my work and also what I have been doing here at Sitka. So, but I'm an ecologist and an artist, and my biggest interest is in communication, especially the communication between us humans and the rest of nature. And I always like to understand how nature is communicating through colors, patterns, shapes that we can find in landscapes. So that's my biggest passion. And I'm going to show some of my works here very quickly. I'm not going to delve into them because of the time. But what I want to say is that I'm really interested in how nature is always sending messages to us as humans, even when we're not paying attention. Nature is there sending messages, right? And this is one example that I want to show here. So this is an artwork that I created when I was doing a residency last year at MSMOCA. And I was there in the winter. And, you know, in the winter in Massachusetts, it can get very gray and snow. So I was looking at the sky and I had, you know, this vision of a blue sky in the middle of the snow. And for me, that was so beautiful. That for me, that was a communication from the sky, sending me a message. Okay, I'm here, I'm blue, right? So I'm sending messages to you through colors. How do you feel as a human looking at the sky? So I kind of started also understanding that the sky can also send messages to us. So that's what I do basically. But what is important for me as an artist and as a biologist as well is to make sure that my work is really integrated into the landscape. So I can understand what are the messages that the landscape is communicating. And I use my artistic and my scientific practice as a way to get these messages when I can. So this is another work that I want to share very quickly. I did this in Portugal. I was also working a very beautiful landscape, and I was looking at the soil, and the soil also can be very colorful, right? And the colors that the soil are showing, it's also a sign, it's a communication sign, it's a message, right? But we often don't pay attention to the soil as humans. We're just, passing by, walking through, and then we don't see the colors. But the soil is very colorful as well. So I was kind of exploring these, possibilities as well, looking at the soil as a way to get messages from nature. And all this understanding happens on the microscopic scale. So when you look at little things, they're also communicating through colors. So this is one of my artworks, one of the projects that I was working in the past, where I'm showing bacteria and fungi growing in petri dishes. And here in this artwork, I'm highlighting how these species that we don't see often as humans, they also can show colors, they also can show patterns, when especially something's decomposing, when something's dying. So they are coming and showing these colors, they are communicating something to us as well as humans. But also these messages, they also, we can also see in the macro scale, in the landscape. So, as I mentioned before, I try to read these messages in the landscapes, and I try to transform these messages, the colors, the patterns, into art. This is another example. So this is another landscape in Portugal as well. I was working in Portugal a lot. And in this work, I was also collecting plants and soil from mountains and rivers and extracting natural dyes from these plants and soils and transforming this into a map using biomaterials. It's a kind of a type of sustainable material that I like to work with. And I was making a map to visualize that landscape through the colors that the landscape can show. This is another example. This is another landscape. It is in South America, in Uruguay. I was working in this beautiful village called Dolores. And in this work, I was also creating or trying to understand the communication from nature, from the landscape. And I was working really, really close to the community in Uruguay. So I was asking local artists, kids from schools to bring me plants that have some kind of emotional attachment to them. And I was transforming these plants into natural dyes and also making installation to show them how we can see the landscape from another perspective. So, they could see, through these fabrics, I was dyeing some fabrics, how the landscape can also be transformed into art. Anyway, all of that to say that now I'm here at Sitka, and, I just want to share very quickly what is happening right now. So when I got here in Otis, I found myself in this beautiful landscape, this colorful landscape with a lot of, shapes and colors and patterns. So I'm just gonna share some of the pictures that I took during my time here. Some clouds with colors, some animals, the beautiful ocean with the sun. So I was looking, at this landscape, and, I was really intrigued. I was like, okay, what is the message that, I have to get from this beautiful place that I am at? And then since then, I have been thinking a lot about what messages this, beautiful landscape wants to communicate to me. And what happened was, when I got here, my first week, I was sitting in my computer, in my house, and I was looking at, from the window, and I can see this huge Sitka spruce stump right in front of my window, right? So I'm always looking at that. So when I saw this huge trunk, this stump in front of me, that's, something started happening in my mind. So that's what I'm doing right now. So after seeing that cut tree, I started thinking about fallen trees and what happens to them when they die, when they fall, if they really die, right? And then I began this journey of photographing all of them, all the trees that I was finding in the landscape. So in the estuary, this is my fellows, Serene and Takaaki, on top of this huge tree. The estuary again with some trees. Also in the forest, I was able to find a lot of trees, fallen trees. And, after seeing all of that, taking pictures, documenting, understanding, kind of talking to them, trying to put them upright, I started seeing that when they fall or die, if they really die, they actually are creating opportunities for other species to thrive. So, you know, we have a lot of moss here, you know, it's a very fluffy forest. So you can see all these moss growing, little mushrooms growing as well from, you know, on top of these trunks, big mushrooms, some aquatic creatures, more mushrooms, and more mushrooms. That's kind of my process, right? So looking at them and now understanding that also they're creating life. They're, you know, giving opportunities for other species as well to live. And then after these observations, some questions started to arise in my mind, such as what do they become, the trees? Do they remain trees or do they dissolve into the lives that now they now are nourishing, right? So are they just trees or they're becoming something else? So what happened was basically, you know, after this observation, after looking at all of this, with those questions in my mind, I started documenting fallen trees in the forest, in the estuary, reflected in murals. So it's super interesting to hear Connor's talk because we didn't have this conversation at all, but I was using murals to, you know, see the trees or to help them to see themselves. So my idea was to bring, you know, bringing in the reflection of the self and identity. And for now, I think I'm exploring the idea of reflection as a way to confront the notion that our realization of self create a distance between us humans and the rest of nature. So when we see ourselves, when we have this realization that we are humans, when we see our reflection, maybe we are creating this distance, but I don't know. I'm just exploring possibilities. So I took a lot of photos of these trees, looking at themselves, you know, the reflections in the mirrors. And again, this is part of my process, right? So I'm taking these photos and thinking and, you know, processing the information and trying to understand, you know, what, you know, those trees are communicating to me. I finally decided to create a site-specific installation here at Sitka to kind of visualize some of these ideas that you know that I have in my mind, and always bringing back these reflections, these questions that I have. So when we see ourselves, when we, you know, realize ourselves, our identities, you know, when you look at our mirror, are we creating these distances between, you know, us and the other? I don't know. So what I did basically in this site-specific installation, I gathered some tree trunks that had fallen in the forest. So I was, you know, walking around, asking the forest if I could, you know, take them to my installation and bring to my installation. You know, really having a conversation with the forest was a super, super amazing, but also exhausting day because I was, you know, putting all my energy in that place. And I was bringing them to this site that I found at Sitka, and I was placing them upright again. And my idea was to make them trees once more. So, you know, now they're, you know, they fell, and now I'm kind of bringing them back, right, to this position. So I don't know if you can see here well, but, you know, I have a circle of trees. And I think my idea here in this installation was to create, you know, this circle that, you know, can give the trees the possibility to have this conversation, even though I don't know what is the conversation because I'm not a tree. Maybe I am, but, you know, they are having this conversation. They are communicating to each other. Maybe they are realizing that they are no longer trees, or maybe, you know, the concept that we have as trees, maybe they, you know, still are trees. So I don't know, but I was putting them together to really make the space for them to have this conversation. And what I did as well, I put some murals in the base of the trees, allowing them to see each other upright again, giving them the possibility to reflect on what they have become after falling. So, you know, from the mirrors, they can see each other, right? So you see some reflections, and really, you know, it's really a metaphor for, you know, this kind of conversation. So it is a site-specific installation, but my idea was also to create this space for the trees to, you know, see each other and to have the conversation. Of course, this is a metaphor for our own existence as humans. So no, I am a human, and I'm putting these trees together. I'm creating these conversations, but this is a metaphor as well for our own existence, right? For our own realization of the self. So I'm always asking these questions: how much does this idealization of ourselves set us apart from the rest of nature, right? So I'm inviting all of you to think about those questions. When we see ourselves, what happens, right? Are we, creating distance between us and nature, or just, getting closer? And then what happened after all of that? I had my fellows again joining me for, this little gathering, and we had an amazing conversation about, the self, the identity, the trees, and that was, for me, a very important moment. It's also what I'm taking from this residency. And then very, very briefly, I'm going to talk about another idea that I'm kind of, thinking and trying to, putting out there. So it is about the red color. So I know, as I said before, I'm a biologist and I work with colors a lot. When I got here in Portland for the first time, for some reason, I started seeing a lot of red things, like red everywhere, like this car, or this t-shirt, this red t-shirt, hanging on a tree, a lot of red signs. I'm not sure, maybe I was biased, like looking just to the, for the red stuff, but I was really finding a lot of reds. And then, I felt very intrigued by, this idea, this color. And I was really, trying to understand what this color is communicating to me. So when I got here at Sitka to Otis, the red came back, but in a different way. I would say in a more beautiful way. So I saw, red everywhere. So the sky, flowers, the rocks, the sun hitting the trees. So everything was red as well. And then here I just realized that, red in nature usually means warning, right? So when we see red in nature, usually, the species are warning us of something. So, and we as humans, we use this red color in our life, in our design, in our, daily life things as a warning sign as well. So you see a lot of red everywhere, right? So, we have the stop signs, we have, no dogs allowed in the trails. So, it's all like this red color saying, okay, it's a warning. Don't go here, don't come here, etc. Like cameras, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, very quickly. So what happened was, after this realization, after seeing all this red stuff, I was asking Jake if I could find some red species here at Sitka. And he said, you can, right? So I was taking this trail, looking around, and I found this species. It is a type of berry, the rubbles. I'm not identifying the species yet. I'm kind of working on this, but the genus is rubus. It is everywhere. It is kind of taking over the landscape. This is up the trail, the Cascade Head Trail. So it is everywhere. And also I found this other species called cotoneaster. It is a little bush that produces this like very red fruit, like a berry. But both of them are introduced. They are not native species. And some people call them, invasive, ornamental, etc. So after that, after finding them and kind of thinking about these names, I'm also thinking of what is the meaning of the color red in this species, and also I'm reflecting how we treat them by those names. Why do we call them invasive, destructives, sometimes aliens? Did they have a choice to be here, or did we humans bring them somewhere they don't belong, right? So what is happening right now here, it is my last week. I'm kind of working and running, but I'm extracting some natural dyes from these plants. So this is the rubus. I'm taking some kind of reddish natural dye from this. It's kind of reddish, not really really red, but it's getting there. And I'm also taking red dye from the cotoneaster, and I'm dyeing some fabrics that I have, cotton fabrics that I have with me. And finally, to finish this, I'm working on this. I'm still, thinking and processing, but my idea is to kind of explore this idea that we as humans, we are the problem actually, not the plants, right? We're always, putting this weight on other species. And I'm kind of questioning this. I'm also, playing with this concept of a flag, especially a red flag, because it's the color from the plants. It is also a warning sign, but also a flag is a symbol of power. and colonization, which played a big role in why these species are here nowadays. So I'm kind of, doing these experimentations. I made this little red flag using the branch from the rubus. It has a lot of thorns, so it's really hard to handle this, which, becomes part of this concept maybe, right? So we're trying to like hold this flag, but the plant is saying, don't touch me, right? So I'm kind of still playing and understanding what I'm doing, but this is kind of one of the directions that I'm taking. And then I'm also exploring another ways to maybe work with the materials. So, hanging them in this very beautiful green landscape to have this contrast. I was also recording these videos using the fabric to have this, again, contrast between the red and the landscape. And yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Takaaki, for taking this picture of me using the headlamp, finding red things in here at Sitka. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe. There are some wonderful comments. Joanne just sharing that they can't help but connect the idea of impertinence from what Connor was sharing to what Felipe is doing with the notion of dead trees. And then Heidi, Felipe shares some information about elderberries and that they're not red right now, but they are red in different times of the year and they're all over Sitka and Cascade Head. And then I just also wanted to share Felipe, the Sitka spruce stump that you showed at the beginning when Sitka had to make a hard decision to have that sick tree come down. We actually harvested branches and needles from it and used them to make and distill us ink from the Sitka spruce needles. And then we brought it into our youth program, K8 Create, and kids worked with a landscape artist to paint images of the forest with the spruce ink. So maybe in a different way, that tree got to be a tree again too. I said at the beginning that Connor Gordon came to Sitka through our blue sky photography residency, and Takaaki Okada is also a blue sky photography resident with Sitka. Takaaki Okada is grateful for the opportunity to explore this precious human life through artistic and spiritual practices. He was born in Tokyo, Japan, and lives in Portland, Oregon. He is humbled to serve these following roles for organizations that he admires and respects: art crew at Apano, member at Columbia University of the Arts Digital Storytelling Lab, advisory council member at OKU, and local Dharma leader at Seattle Insight Meditation Society. In his own words, Takaaki shares, "I wouldn't be here without the wisdom, patience, and generosity of my mother, my father, and my family, my ancestors and all ancestors, my mentors and teachers, and my beautiful friends. I bow deeply to my grandfather who lived the life of an artist. May my practice be a gesture of respect to the land which has been stewarded by Indigenous tribes and peoples since time immemorial." Sitka community, please join me in giving Takaaki Okada a warm Sitka welcome.
Thank you so much, Allison. First want to mention thank you to Blue Sky, amazing program, especially sort of through the Drawers program into this. And what an honor to be able to share this with Connor and see your work. Really, really inspiring to see your work. And Felipe, it's just this space to be here with you and with all of you here and everyone who's tuned in. I really feel massive gratitude, honored to be here. And it just happens to be that this is my last full day here at the residency. So it's really a special opportunity to be able to share what my practice has looked like the past 4 weeks. And you'll see, I hope you'll see that this idea that this is my work, or the idea of the self, as Felipe talked about, is very porous. And first of all, so in that sort of sense, I think this is why I think the self, the idea of self, is very porous, because just really cannot do any of this without everyone's help. Here is Sasha, my partner. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you for coming here, dropping me off, and now picking me up. Can't really do this without the support and allowing me to be here for such a long time, to be able to really focus on something that means very important to me. Yeah, my family, really, well, I don't know where to even begin. It's just sort of, just to have this opportunity to play, to explore. What a wonderful life. Here at Sitka, of course, I just do want to mention a photo on the far right, who's a Blue Sky resident also, my friend and collaborator, Christian, who so kindly had me over last year after the ice storm. That allowed me to visit and really did make it concrete that this was something to do. So that really set the course of this path. And here's another example of massive gratitude. Like I do want to mention, I got to spend an art session with Leona and Nicola at Nestaka K8. These are some of the photos that were sort of like the posters that were up on the wall there, which I thought was very interesting in relation to some of the work I'm doing. Clouds, of course. I got to make a little art piece about migration and movement there with the fourth graders and fifth graders, and it was just to be together and make art together was such a great experience, and I really hope that the relationship continues from here. And yes, Alison, thank you for mentioning Chachala Museum. Please, this is an amazing place. Crystal, David, Mac, taking so much out of their time to give us a tour. Yeah, learned so much, had a lovely conversation and learned so much about what it means to be a really good caretaker, a steward of this land and our ancestors. And Hayu Masi, that's the calligraphy piece by Crystal on the right. And yeah, of course, fellow residents. The ones that I particularly got to overlap with quite a bit. Sadly, Jeannie had to go a little bit on the early side. I hope, Jeannie, you're doing well. I've gotten these mantras from them that I carried all throughout my practice here and will continue to carry. So Kai on the left gave me this mantra to photograph a cloud, be a cloud. And Felipe, of course, the mantra is observe, observe, observe. Felipe can spot anything in any environment. We'd be looking at something just like we can't see anything. Felipe would be like, can't you see? There's the newt. And it's like, what? I don't know how Felipe does it. And Tering, who gave me this mantra of enjoy language, and just to be able to take some of the stress out and just really enjoy language. So I hope I'm going to share some pictures that I've been taking every day and some sort of just a bit of writing that goes along with it. And I hope that this is sort of a souvenir of my time here and a gift in the shape of maybe a cloud-shaped, like a fridge magnet. So thank you so much. We'll get it going. Relationship advice. You'll never be able to listen to whatever you're trying to hear when we are together. I'll never be able to make a gap between the clouds, however much I love the moon. I also struggle between the times of being together and being by myself. It takes a toll to keep finding these small voices between the phases. When your eyes are closed, you'll see that the moon is breathing for you unimpeded. Voice message, January 16th, 2025. For Jerry. Partner, what do you think if we were to open a shop on the island that only sold those wooden boards with messages that people put in their bathrooms and garages? You know, something you'd ponder as you're sitting there, or a mantra before paddling out. Partner, you listen to all the tides and every raindrop on the roof. I was dragging a cold kayak along the shore at sunset. Once I got to the boat ramp, I noticed that my hands were pretty numb. I rubbed them together fearfully. I needed a message that would get feelings back into my hands. You taught me how to stoke my own flame that's loud enough for warmth by blowing toward the heart, and also how you spoke to me in fireworks. Splitting logs in smoke, clouds aren't some misty air. They clearly resist us, but I know it's you clattering around the seatbelt signs. Partner, so far I only have 2 boards. One of them has carvings of a few disheveled dog furs on it and says, "Old growth all over the place." The other one says, "Partner, I miss you all the time." Does not follow. A cloud sighs with such collective confidence, knowing that the next inhale it takes will not come from its own lungs. A cup of coffee cuts open a frame of a floor-to-ceiling window and squints over the horizon for the arrival of a promise. Instead, sweep the path. Instead, move as a circle. Make no more decisions. Reduce yourself to such clarity, to a point of becoming a non sequitur. I also stepped on so many mushrooms. I punched this kid in the face so hard it broke his teeth. He didn't enjoy having himself compared to a blissed out monkey listening to some blissed out tune with the latest Sony Walkman. I went home, saw that ad again, and thought about asking my mother, "Can I have a Walkman for Christmas?" He went home where he, his brothers, his mother and his father all wore a matching necklace with a cotton pouch hanging in front of their solar plexus, Inside, a gold-plated sun, the word of my father's father's father. My childhood memory is inside a box of Nintendo cartridges. Many starts, a few one-ups, a notebook filled with cheat codes, and none of the games completed. Bundled up in her chest, on a sunny day, my mother takes us on a walk, teaching me in her mother's language, pointing at a cloud in the sky. Kumo. Back at home, a web, inside a wooden toy block ruin, pointing at a spider. Kumo. I've killed enough spiders, and yet sometimes I get to have a cloud's gap's length of time of some bliss. A glimmer of everything. I dreamt last night that everything is a whole. If you ever named a cloud, then when it rains, it's your body falling into a pitch dark hole you named Earth. You aren't dying. There's nothing that hasn't been named. Write your name in my mother's tongue until you can see that the ink has faded. What is the meaning of your given name? It's the same as mine. Every name is true. They occur. They cannot be made. All else is a distraction. Everything is whole. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Takaaki, for taking us inside your practice and closing our talk tonight with such beautiful images and your words and the soundscape. So thank you, Takaaki and Connor and Felipe, for sharing your work with us tonight. Thank you, Sitka community, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you at our next resident talk. Good night, everybody.